We will move on to the NDP. I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Minister. I am here to ask some questions about our film and television industry. Surprise, surprise. Last year, do you need a second for people to come down?
Go ahead.
Okay. Last year, the minister confirmed to us that the amount that the province was spending on film and television incentives is roughly equivalent to what was being spent when we offered a tax credit on labour spending. And in November 2018, you announced an additional $6 million for the fund, bringing the total spending above where we were on the tax credit. In the last full year of the tax credit, it cost the government $23.5 million. I'm of course glad to see that the levels of investment in the industry are mostly restored, but it continues to beg the question, which I've asked for 3 years in a row, when the tax credit was much more effective at generating film jobs and economic activity, why won't the government reinstate it?
I recognize the honourable minister for Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'm shocked that this member is asking this question about film screen. Look, it's certainly, as the member knows, we had this discussion of around the tax credit, the incentive fund, and sort of the differences. And again, this is one of those times where you can't deny the history and sort of the process around changing that fund and sort of what happened here at the legislature. And the very strong reaction from the industry, and I think that in fairness and in honesty, we're still working on repairing that relationship. And I think that those at the helm, Screen Nova Scotia, and those who represent the community, that industry and the sector and the screen and film community are doing a good job with understanding our position as well as advocating for their people. And I think that the ideas around the local content, the incentives, I think that in principle, and I don't want to go too far, but I believe that the Mike Volpes and those who are sort of have been involved in those conversations can appreciate those aspects of it. And I think, why wouldn't they? Local content and having the labor piece sort of identified and having some consistency and transparency around when the money goes out and how it all kind of is administered through NSBI. I think that is all acceptable. I believe. I think that what we're seeing now, and I met with Screen Nova Scotia a few weeks ago. There certainly is, obviously by way of the numbers, a draw to this incentive fund. I think that what happens moving forward in big productions and what happens in terms of those who seem to feel the impact of some of the uncertainty around with local providers of the necessities around wardrobe and the other sort of real specialized skills and specialized needs that the sector has. They felt that. So obviously for us, it becomes around seeing a bit of a stability in the sector now, and going back to where we were. That's just not something that we are going to do, quite frankly. And I think that given the amount of investment that we have, I think does show that commitment. One of the things that happened before my time was there was a lot of concern in the community and those who are connected to film and screen and all those direct and indirect components of that sector were concerned that there would be a cap. And I think that you see year over year, the last few years, that we've exceeded the budgetary line item that we had. So really, we've been very open, and I think that Laurel and her team at NSBI have done a great job nurturing that relationship, understanding what's coming in the pipeline. And I think that part of the move from the tax credit to the incentive fund was that predictability. So I think that when Laurel and her team get together and they work on with this industry on what's in the pipeline, what's coming down. The creation of that certainty and knowing sort of what's on the horizon, and understanding what we have to do to make sure that we don't create any kind of disruption, and we don't push away any not only productions but the people who are on the ground here. Again, as I told this story last year, but it bears repeating because we were in the red chamber, and now that we're in the big room, it's important to have this on the record. I went with Mike Volpe the summer before last to see a taping of Mr. D, an episode. It was out in close to Spryfield, and I was absolutely blown away by the number of people that were on the ground for a production like that. Now I know, of course, Mr. D is a big one. This hour is a big one, and that's not the norm. The norm are sort of the smaller productions and the different things that happen inside of that the culture and creative film and screen industry. But to see the number of people, young people that were there, it was in a hockey rink, and I could not believe that, you're looking and there's hundreds of people inside this rink, and it just funnels down to basically, one camera. So it's the shot in the moment, but it's all those people making that shot happen. And as much as I built an appreciation for the industry and the sector in Nova Scotia, that was just to see it up close and personal and to understand how many people are impacted by the sector was an eye opener for me, and I've always carried that with me. And again, I think that that's guided my relationship with the industry. It has been always positive and respectful, of course. The reality is that the 20 million budgeted this year, 23.8 last year was the spend. It is a significant investment, and again, not sort of diminishing the position of the member on the old fund, or trying to extinguish the feelings that the industry had about the old tax credit, but we're in a place where, for better or for worse, people see balanced budgets differently. I'm a huge believer in them and seeing how they impact a provincial economy. I'm more a believer every year that the Premier has sort of stuck to that discipline, and 4 balanced budgets in a row matters. But I think that inside that context, there were things that, there would have been things that we would have liked to have done, but we just couldn't do them because we're committed to balance and surplus budgets, balance in the books. But we have never had a conversation about impacting that tax credit, and here we are again, that the incentive fund, and here we are again putting that same amount of money in, and we'll continue to work with NSBI to manage the number of requests that we have, and not having said no to anything at this point, I think is an indication that we are still committed to working with the industry. And there's a number of things that Mike and the gang bring forward every time we meet around different equity funds and things we can do with the percentages. But at the end of the day, those conversations will continue. But I can tell the member that where we are, just in terms of how the incentive fund is tracked and controlled for our purposes, the certainty around that, the impact on the all-in spend for the local talent, and doing what we can to support Nova Scotia labor here inside that industry. We're comfortable with where we're at, and we're not going to revisit it at this point.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you for that answer. It actually brings up many of the things I'm going to ask very specific questions about. But I do want to just reply to a couple of things that the minister has just brought up in his answer. I really, truly feel like cutting the tax credit is a missed opportunity. The minister spoke about balanced budgets. Great. I know that the Minister of Health and I had an exchange about balanced budgets the other night, and I don't want to have that same exchange here. But this is not a question of balanced budgets. The film tax credit, we know that the economic spin-offs from that credit were benefiting the economy of Nova Scotia. We had way more people at work. We had people in good jobs, and I believe the investment, it was the PricewaterhouseCoopers report came out saying that for every dollar invested, there was a $7 return. I'm pretty sure that was the number. So it's not a question of balanced budgets, but it is a question of a missed opportunity. Because what has happened, and the minister has alluded to this, what has happened since the tax credit was cut is that though we've had the same amount of financial investment, so the same amount put into the expenses line in our budget, the return is not nearly as much. And we have seen, we know that there's still lots of productions, and I want to say Mr. D is an amazing example, but Mr. D is exactly what I'm talking about. It's a big production that hires a whole slew of different types of workers, including actors. I get the CNS reports. I get the announcements whenever a film project is approved, and I'm always excited to see what's coming up. You know, Digstown was one. It was amazing. Actually, I don't even know. I think Nova Scotia contributed to Digstown. It was shot here anyway, so I hope it did. Mr. D, 22 Minutes. The one about the no. Never mind, doesn't matter. The series that we've seen in the last couple of years. But the fact is that most of the productions that come through being funded are tiny little productions, which again are very important to our industry, and I'll get to that in a second, or documentaries, which again are also important to our industry, but have very, very much smaller crews and people being paid. Maybe not smaller crews, but definitely smaller cast and crews. So, I think it's great that the incentive fund is where it is, and it is working for certain productions and certain people, but the industry has not recovered from the tax credit cut. It has not recovered, and I want to make sure that, I know you understand. I know the minister understands that it hasn't recovered, but it shocks me, and it's truly mystifying that the government is holding so hard and fast to this decision when what it could do is change its mind, bring back the tax credit, and reinvigorate our industry, which was so vibrant and had put Nova Scotia on the map. We aren't on the map anymore. I've heard this from industry professionals, from people at Screen Nova Scotia and from other producers. We are no longer in the game. We are no longer competitive in the international market, and it is because the tax credit is gone. When people from Nova Scotia go in to have meetings in LA and New York and other places where productions are considering investing in Nova Scotia, the first question they are asked is, what is your tax credit? And when the information is that we don't have a tax credit, but we have this fund which kind of works the same way as a tax credit, and I know there's a cap, but there's not really a cap because we can add, let's just have the conversation. The attentions of the producers have gone. Some of the big producers leave the room. It does not work the same way. I would love, believe me, I would love it if it did. All I want is for our film industry to be as robust and as great as it could be. And all I want is for us to have the same experience that Ontario and Vancouver and Manitoba are having right now, where they don't have the crews to supply the business. That is not our case anymore. And it's a real shame. The other thing I wanted to mention is anyway, you've heard me. I'm going to go on to my next question. I'm going to talk about the incentive fund a little bit. So I'm wondering if your department has any plans to make changes to the incentive fund in an effort to support more film and television industry jobs. So we know, again, the biggest issue with the tax credit being cut is that it was a labor tax credit. The fund is an all spend. so it doesn't necessarily ensure that money will be spent on people and people who pay taxes in the province. So I'm wondering if there's anything you can do, or anything that you have plans to do to change the fund so that it encourages workers and jobs for workers.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the member for the question. And look, we talk about this a lot, and I know she's passionate about it and has a lot of depth and understanding about the the sector, and she was involved in the sector herself, and maybe still may be, and certainly has close contacts there. So I understand the concern and the focus on this particular issue. One of the things I just wanted to, I guess, probably clarify maybe. I haven't heard, and again, this is in direct conversations, I have not heard at any point that there's any particular challenge with this vis-a-vis the tax credit. So again, whether it be a follow-up or whether when the member gets back on her feet again, or if there's some other information, the conversations I had, it's not. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint a picture that it's rosy, but I've never heard that there's any challenge or a disincentive for productions and people who would access the fund vis-a-vis the tax credit. I've never heard that. Obviously, if there were more money in it, that is something that's advocated and sort of pushed for. Obviously, to make changes in terms of, again, an equity fund or things like that, those things are pushed for. But at no point has anyone said it doesn't work as smoothly as the tax credit did. People don't seem, those producers and production operations don't seem to have any challenges accessing it, from my information. So just to tell the member that, doesn't have to be in her reaction, but maybe just later on, because my understanding is very different on that particular piece of it. I think that, and again, I don't have a tremendous level of comfort sort of, comparing other jurisdictions, because it's sort of, you sort of begin to highlight, sort of get down that road of which jurisdictions place which particular importance on film and screen. But I think that the reality is, and again, I've had this conversation with those that I meet with in the sector, and they get it. I mean, being vibrant and supporting the industry and having different ideas on how to do that is of critical importance. But there's also a reality in this country that Ontario and BC and Quebec, we're never going to be them, and no one's advocating that we should be. But they're just so far ahead of the game in terms of where they're at with these productions, and I think that one of the big pieces, the incentive fund, is one part of that. I think that theirs is different than ours. I think we're close in terms of the mechanism with Alberta, but one of the things that I've heard over and above the direct investment in the injections of funds, whether it's a tax credit, an incentive, or something else, there's other competitive advantages, and I think that Nova Scotia, and Mike Volpe said this, that the lighthouse that was shot down in Yarmouth, that was just the most perfect place to do a production like that for a number of reasons. But and Nova Scotia has lots of those things, and that's one aspect of it. And every province would boast that they have similar places and setups and experiences, circumstances that would support filming and sort of have the right backdrop and circumstances. But the other big piece, and one that we have been having discussions on, is this whole idea around infrastructure. And the member mentioned Manitoba, and I always wonder, because I think we're close sort of in the relative share of our Canadian market. We're 1 to 2% of the Canadian market for film and screen productions, and I think that Manitoba has done a particularly good job in the hard infrastructure, sound stages, performing centers, things like that. That really, I think that we don't have those particular things, and the arts and cultural link that's here at the World Trade is a significant one. We've had the conversations around the prospects of supporting a sound stage here in Metro, and I think that those things are part of it as well. So there is a multifaceted piece of this, and I don't know, and it probably would almost be a question for the member to sort of add her comment on it, but where, you know, as a government, if we're in a certain place with the incentive fund, at what point do we sort of continue to focus just on that aspect of support for the sector, or do we branch off? And I'm not saying just take the money from one place to the other, but when do we sort of, you know, once you have that incentive fund sort of locked down, then you start looking at other aspects of you know, the development of that sector. So if it's sound stages and the like, and I think that that's part of it. I think that again, Ontario, the three big jurisdictions, Ontario, Quebec, BC, they've got such a competitive advantage by way of their history, by way of the investments that were made over significant periods of time. You know, that's no one, again, is suggesting that we have to catch up to them, but it's understanding sort of where you fit in the overall Canadian market, where your opportunities lie. And I think that, you know, for the record, the folks in our industry here do an absolutely incredible job selling Nova Scotia. They spend a significant amount of time at the, you know, the film festivals. They have a real good presence and a solid network in Hollywood. So they're always looking for those opportunities, and I think that you know, making investments in arts centers and things of that nature, you see in other provinces, and not that, certainly not going to digress back again to the Yarmouth Ferry, but there were some we've read articles just about some of these investments, and basically the investments in some of this hard infrastructure essentially works to be a subsidy to the industry by way of, you know, bailing out a particular soundstage. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that if that's a decision that a particular government makes, they see the need for it, then that's okay. And having Invest Nova Scotia, talking to Mark Allman, the Invest Nova Scotia platform, their mandate, and sort of, you know, how they look at the impact of arts, culture, film, screen, was a great avenue for us to explore. And the Link Arts Centre, 2.79 million was our investment there. I think that obviously when you put that in the hands of the capable people that are up there, they're going to make that work, and they're going to stretch that a long way. And I think that, you know, we look forward to what the impact is for that. But I think that in that from that regard, there's more to consider. And there's, again, a number of different ways in which we can support the sector. But at the same time, and again, I get where I think it's just a difference in philosophy with respect to the balanced budget piece. I know what the member's saying, but there's certain parameters that we have to live inside, and you know, with all things being considered, I think that you know, by way of this number in the line item, we are committed to making sure we've got that support there for the sector.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I hear you that you're not going to make changes to the fund. Yeah, I just want to, I'm not going to belabor the tax credit question, because I know we're not going to come to an agreement on it, but I just do again want to address a couple of things the minister has said. First of all, when I mentioned Ontario, yes, of course, dollar for dollar, we are never going to be competitive with Ontario, but with respect, Minister, it sounds like the minister is giving up, that we will never be as good as our big brothers and sisters in Western Canada. We were very competitive. We were competitive, and had this break in our industry not have happened, we would be receiving tons of the overflow that is happening in those other provinces. The fact is that Ontario do not have enough people to work all the productions that they have, and this is not just in Toronto. This is in Northern Ontario. This is in Sudbury, which is a town much like, you know, Halifax in many ways in terms of size, and so I don't accept that answer in terms of you know, we should discount that idea. The minister, I know, understands that our film industry is an ecosystem. And so at the top, we have these large-scale productions, these productions that come in from LA and New York and elsewhere all around the world, where we have a local producer on the ground, like a Mike Volpe or Hallman, Red Rock Productions, so local producers on the ground, and those are big. Those are important for our industry because they supply, or they require the crews to learn the skills. And so when those companies and those productions were coming in the heyday in the the 90s and the early 2000s, we trained crews, we put programs into our universities, and then we had the crews that could service them. But meanwhile, those crews are making their own local productions and making the stories that we call our local stories. So then we have low budget feature films. We have all kinds of amazing short films. And so that is a significant part. And yes, the current fund does support that work. And then we have the emerging filmmakers, the people who are making the 1 minutes and the 5 minutes. And they have the script development program from CCH does support them. But the problem is that all of these things have to work together as an ecosystem. And when we take away the larger food chain animals, as it were, if I'm going to keep with my with my references here, the whole ecosystem doesn't work together. So, like I said, I'm going to leave that behind. But the minister did reference the soundstage, so I'm going to talk about that. So when you talk about when we're going to sort of divert from the discussion around the funding and the fund and all of that, and go, how else can we support our industry? The soundstage is definitely one way, but I'll get to that in a second. The industry says that the $4 million cap, so if we're talking about the fund now, the $4 million cap on funding acts as a significant disincentive for larger productions coming to Nova Scotia, or even to consider Nova Scotia. And the department has made plenty of statements, and it's well known that that cap is flexible. And let's have a discussion, let's talk about it, we can make it work. And I do applaud the people who are working with this fund to make it work for many productions, because the ones that have happened are because of the work of those folks. But the problem is, again, when we're at the table, there are many producers who are just going to discount even looking at Nova Scotia because of the amount, like the cap right now. They're not interested in a discussion. They just want to know if they're looking at 3 jurisdictions where they could choose to shoot their film, and this is a film that doesn't require the beautiful landscapes of Yarmouth or the beautiful landscapes of Peggy's Cove or whatever. I'm talking about something that could be shot anywhere, which is most films, or many films. Then they won't even look at us because of that. So my question is, why doesn't the department just increase the base rate and eliminate the cap from the guidelines? Eliminate the cap from the guidelines, or increase the base rate, so that if we're talking of an incentive fund and not a tax credit, it can be more competitive.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank the member for the question. With respect to the cap, I don't know. There's been maybe a few one-offs in terms of expression of concern around the cap, the $4 million. If I'm remembering correctly, was the mist north of? Yeah. So 4 points. So I think that in that was one of those circumstances whereby it was sort of an isolated conversation, and I think that anytime something comes up as a suggestion or a potential project that's north of $4 million, that I think that it is a discussion that we do have to have at the department level, of course, with our partners at NSBI, discussing about those options. And again, I haven't heard sort of wholesale across the board that there's issues with this $4 million cap on one particular production. But I'm sure, as the member said, that if there's a production that's north of that, they may not even look at Nova Scotia as a jurisdiction. But I guess that's where it becomes, I don't know, it's challenging, and it's frustrating for the industry sometimes. But if we were to lift that cap, I mean, we still have, and it is a guideline, and you set guidelines for a reason to sort of keep it in a certain range. So if you've got a $20 million budget and you eliminate the cap, and a production comes in that's $10 million, then you've just evaporated, used up, applied 50% of your budget on one project. So again, I think it is a continuing conversation. The good thing about this is I think that when you look at the history and sort of the ebb and flow of the investment incentive fund and all the ways things have changed in terms of the budgets and these conversations about caps on the overall allotment, caps per production. I really do look forward to the sunsetting, the 5-year review that's coming next fiscal year. And if I have any luck, there'll be a cabinet shuffle by then, and it won't be me dealing with it. So, yeah, that's right. I said that, guys, up there. But it is it is an important conversation to have, and it really is. It's way more complex when you get into the bowels of this discussion, and I think that looking at how these caps are applied, because it's you can make a sensible assessment about something, anything, and Phil's an example, and then when you talk to someone in the industry, just like if any other scenario, they can give you a perspective that you don't even consider. So again, I've had that kind of experience in working with Screen for the last couple of years, and I think that, and the entire sector, not just Screen, those who are impacted by this incentive fund, and I think that, when the 5-year review comes next year, I think that it really is a chance to put all of this on the table. So if you're looking at that sort of production cap, what's the impact on the overall budget? The member mentioned the base rate. That's one that certainly has been advocated for to change that. But again, that increases the budget. So I do just want to say, I would never. I know that the member's not saying this, in a personal sense, and that I'm, sort of turning my back on the industry. But using sort of the way I characterize it, that I'm giving up. That's not the case at all. There's a sort of a line between giving up and realizing that you're not going to compete with Ontario, but just because that's the case, it doesn't, I don't want to diminish the importance of the industry, the sector, and on the critical nature of maintaining this incentive fund. So we aren't giving up, and I think that when you look at the details, and again, the member having that kind of intimate understanding of the sector, there has been shifts and changes, and I think that it is an evolving sector as is. We were 1% to 2% of the Canadian market, and we still are. The way that the ebbs and flows have taken place with this particular sector and its relationship with government and the support we give, sometimes it's almost surprising that has stayed static in that range. But again, there's shifting human resources that are part of that, and there's changing competitive advantage in the industry as well. So I think that if we're going to change, does it become around that 5-year review and looking at how we do things differently? Because I'll tell you, it's an amazing thing. The way that the entire sector, screen and film, the industry has changed is absolutely mind-blowing. And the member mentioned, these short productions. It's staggering the hunger for content now. I mean, Netflix and these content providers, it's not television anymore, and it's not going, it's less of going to the movies and big screen productions. It's just massive content being churned out and churned out and churned out, and that's where, even though the way things were maybe a relatively static market, it's going to look a lot different now. And you look at what happens with what happens with the moving. You talk about core competencies, but when you're inside of a content providing sort of push now, it's incredible what happens in breakneck speed and somewhat relatively low budgets, but there's certainly some heavy budget applications being provided to the content for Craven, Netflix, and such, HBO, and all those players that are out there looking for stories and for shows and documentaries and movies and nonfiction that are applicable to a changing market. I never would have thought that my favorite show of all time in any genre is Game of Thrones, and Jason Momoa was one of the key actors in the first couple of years, and I was coming into Sydney and I was driving by a vehicle and it was parked and it was him, and I thought I was losing my mind. So I pulled over and I said, "I'm a huge Game of Thrones fan. Am I okay here?" He's like, "Yeah, Jason, I'm here for 2 weeks at the Fortress of Louisbourg shooting Frontier, which is on Netflix." And the majority of that was in Newfoundland, but he was in Sydney. And it's just a remarkable change. And I think that's where, our industry is going to be. And I think that they're concerned now, again, as you get to the end of this 5-year program, and you look at what happens next, it's going to come in critical. So I think that those conversations and keeping that relationship live, it truly matters to us.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Exactly. People are content hungry. Things are being made all over the place. It's easier and easier to make things and have them seen. And that's why we need to be competitive on the world stage, because we do have stuff that wants to be shot here. And so this is exactly right. That if we had a better system and we could be more welcoming to bigger productions, because those are big productions. Game of Thrones is a big production, and so is the other one that you mentioned. If we could welcome them in a more competitive way, if we could make it easier for them to choose Nova Scotia, then we would be full of work. And I'm telling you, it is an economic driver. It's like the minister wants to improve tourism, to bring $4 billion of tourism money to the province, to do all of these excellent plans in business. Film is business, and we could be competitive in that way. I'm so glad to hear that there's going to be a 5-year review. It's shocking to think that it's 5 years is coming up. And I really do hope that the minister will consult with all of the people in the industry, not just the producers at that level, but the minister needs to consult with the trade unions, with regular old artists that are working, on those small productions, and also the big producers. Because again, it is an ecosystem. So speaking of that, 5 years ago, Nova Scotia had 20 producers focused on telling local stories. But since the tax credit was cut, they've been unable to keep afloat, and now we only have 5. And I want to know if the minister will acknowledge the impacts of that choice on those folks.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And look, I'm not tone deaf or sort of, and I certainly don't block out the impact that that is expressed to me in this portfolio and having this relationship with Screen and being connected to the film industry and the sector now. I think that again, there was a number of moving parts around the labor component and what's shifting in terms of the bulk number of those employed in the industry, and I think that there's a number of different factors that have impacted. Having said that, there's no question that there was when the credit changed and the relationship changed and went to the incentive fund. It created, whether perceived or actual. I wasn't in the conversations. I didn't, and I was backfilling with information when I took over this portfolio in 2017, but there was no doubt an impact, and I think that the way that the sector changed again, the overall numbers indicate that we were steady in terms of our market share of productions in the country. But again, I can't deny things that I'm told, and the way in which the industry changed and the sector changed here. And I think that, part of that, if part of that was an impact around confidence from the sector and people who are in that industry, then, that's a reality that was part of this whole journey with respect to the tax credit becoming the incentive fund. And I think that, I've talked to people in the industry, both formally and informally. I think that those who left and were, moved on to other places are looking to come back, and they're looking for these new opportunities as there is a need for content. But look, I mean, it's, by way of the investment, by way of almost 50 productions last year, 24 million on the ground. It's not as if the province isn't investing. And again, I think that some of the requests and the demands, the suggestions around what could change, again, to my knowledge and my sort of history on this, they've never been specific to this fund isn't working. It's around the other aspects, increasing it, changing the threshold, investing in the hard wiring, the hard infrastructure, things like that. And I think that moving forward, just like tourism, if there's things that we can do and support the growth in that sector, then we'll certainly do that. And again, it's apples and oranges, so not comparing one to the other. Tourism is a massive sector, one of our key pillars. But quite frankly, we've held the line by and large in terms of the budgetary spend on tourism year over year. We stay within that certain range. We're strategic in our marketing. We're strategic in how we build out our relationship with Destination Canada, how we target those markets in the U.S. and the U.K. and China, et cetera. And we stick to the program, and we allow and we work with and allow, once we make those decisions around budget and such, allow the experts to do their thing. And it's the same for film. The money's allocated, the money's been identified. This is the budget that we're talking about here, and I think that many are obviously, even in the thick of it, many in the industry stayed and sort of continued to work on how they would, continue to grow and flourish here and have opportunities for productions and such. And clearly we want to make sure that we're doing our best now and moving forward, that we're supporting them. And again, confidence is significant. So feeling that they're supported by their government is critical. And I think that, by this investment and by the willingness to have these conversations and continue to look to see what we can do next is critical. And I think that, for a lot of people, there's no signal whatsoever that, anything's going to change. And I know not to tell stories around other things, but the digital animation tax credit folks who are in that, utilize that program, were in to meet me not long ago with the Minister of Immigration. And basically their thing was, don't change it. We just, for certainty reasons, for stability reasons, their position was, where it's at is okay. Obviously that may be a very different conversation with Screen Nova Scotia as we get to this 5-year review, and they may look at different things. But I think that one of their overall, fundamental positions is going to be, okay, let's start looking at ways we can do it differently. But is it changing? Is it being reduced? I think that's going to be the big question, of course. So, again, I think the importance of certainty and the importance of open communication with the sector is critical. I think that, again, given the fact of 50 productions and it's not, we're not losing a whole lot of ground in terms of national market share. And again, look, we always want more, don't get me wrong, and I brought the issue up, and I agree with the member just around this whole notion of the new world of content that we're in. There will be opportunities there, and we, like everything else, we've got to play our role to help the private sector and the industry take advantage of that.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Earlier you mentioned a soundstage, and I said that I would come back to it as well. It is true that we don't have a soundstage. We used to. Now it's Nova Scotia Power. But I'm wondering, so you did mention the Culture Link as well, and I wanted to say that I think the Culture Link is a great project, but that soundstage, or that studio, which presumably 22 Minutes will move into, is not a full-on soundstage where large productions can't come in and it won't be big enough, basically. And so given that there are some productions that are still interested in Nova Scotia, but a soundstage would make us much more interesting and competitive and attractive, is the government planning on investing in a soundstage?
I recognize the honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you for that question, and again, it is a conversation that I've had many times. I think that the industry has identified, and again, I hope I'm not violating any negotiations or commercial sensitivities, but I think they're using a place now that they would love to see. I think long term. I'll leave it at that. That's those who are involved in those conversations will work on that. But quite frankly, Screen and others who are in the sector have convinced me that it is a critical piece of infrastructure, and I think that we need the challenge is, and I think the member heard my opening comments. Just when we change the way we do business in terms of ERDT to business, we've really become the leads in terms of the spending has become our crowns. And we're really focused on policy and sort of regulation and things like that connect to the private sector. So there's not, the way it used to be is not the way it is anymore. And we don't do direct incentives in terms of subsidies or grants or things like that. But the way we structured the Department of Business, I find that when there's a legitimate opportunity that fits into a mandate, there is some avenues, and I think that, and I told Mike this during our conversation, Invest Nova Scotia is the perfect place to consider something like this. And again, not to put the Invest Board on the spot or too much pressure to do this, but I think that they are the absolute perfect. That's who work with Mark Allman on the link. And I think that they're, again, the same place. The mandate that they have is perfectly aligned with something like this. So I certainly think that it goes without saying they would know where the Department of Business fits, but clearly Invest is independent. They will do an assessment, but I think that submitting something to them would be a good place. So we did give that indication to Screen, and I certainly hope, I know that everything that organization does, they do well. So I know that if they were to do an application and have that business case put forth, I know it would be of quality, and I think that Invest would give that every consideration.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you. It's great to hear that answer. The current incentive system includes a 2% bonus for shooting in rural parts of Nova Scotia. However, the feedback from the industry that we've received is that 2% is not significant enough to encourage shifting more of the production to rural areas. Are you hearing that feedback or observing that the bonus is ineffective? And if so, do you have plans to improve it? I'll leave it there.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think the long and the short of it is that for me, sort of anecdotally and directly, I thought it would have more that incentive to be sort of outside of the metro area, outside the core, would be something that producers and crews would be particularly interested in, but that hasn't been the case. And I'm trying to remember, I don't want to put Laura from Screen on the spot, but I think it was her that was just talking about, we had this discussion when Mike and Laura and I met, it was probably a month and a half ago or so, maybe, give or take. And this is one of the things that we were sort of discussing, and Bernie has always sort of followed the data and sort of the trend lines here with respect to this fund, and it just does. There's so many other pieces around why locations are the desired locations. And again, when you look at something like the lighthouse, and that was just tailor-made for Yarmouth, and Mike and Laura both said that that's just where it was going to be no matter what. That hasn't been a significant impact of having that incentive to bring people outside of metro, because the factors of location are just way bigger than what that financial incentive would be. So again, that was a carryover, and the numbers were the same as what they were in the old tax credit. So I think that there certainly warrants a discussion again when we get into the 5-year review, if that's something that should look different or should be adjusted. Then I think that might be something that we would look at for sure. If again, with respect to this, I know that it's pretty static and it's a 5-year review. But we're not, we're open to the logic and the common sense. So if people like Laura and Mike and Screen and those in the sector are seeing this as not being, as impactful as it should be, then obviously there would be some rationale for us to change that. So we're always open to it. But again, it'll stay pretty constant until we hit that 5-year review.
I recognize the Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The large budget projects that have dried up since the cancellation of the tax credit brought in a lot of out-of-province investment than the smaller productions that the new investment fund, or incentive fund, I should say, prioritizes. The Directors Guild of Canada estimates that 3 to 4 times more out-of-province investment was happening with the tax credit. I'm wondering if the department has done any analysis on how the change has impacted the department's goals of increasing export dollars coming into Nova Scotia and creating jobs for Nova Scotians.
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank the member for the question. I just wanted to get some clarification from Deputy Miller on that one. So basically, it's a good point, and I think that it's at the foundation of the rationale for this change, and it's because when you're looking at the Indigenous sort of Nova Scotia production, so all of these these incentives are laden based on Nova Scotia writers, producers, etc. So it's taking that homegrown talent, taking the people that are here, that build the foundation of the framework for the industry, and exporting that outward. And I think that don't get me wrong, any imported money So producers coming into Nova Scotia, whether it's location or it's crews or it's expertise that's here on the ground, or it's the added value of accessing money from the incentive fund, that's all great, and it's incredibly important, and it speaks to the value of the industry. But when we're talking truly the export piece of that, it becomes about how much we can use that money to leverage local talent, skill, content, investment, etc., and obviously have that final product, move out to the rest of the world. And again, of course, this hour, Mr. D, Trailer Park Boys are the big ones, but there's all kinds of smaller productions that are taking place. And again, not to go back down the road of the new world of on-demand content, but I think that that will certainly become the export portion of this particular sector. So certainly with an export lens, and any investment that we can make in the Nova Scotians and send their product out is exactly what we're looking for in terms of our mandate for film, for the Department of Business, as well as for my Department of Trade as well.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
I'm just wondering, to follow up that question, does the department or NSBI have any measures of how many out-of-province dollars the current projects approved through the incentive fund are bringing in?
I recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the member, if she wouldn't mind, so there's an expenditure, projected expenditure of Nova Scotia of $77 million for the 50 productions. But if she would just indulge us, we can go back to the department and drill down a little bit. We can figure out and sort of probably decipher and sort of screen out which is our Indigenous Nova Scotia sort of productions versus which is our outside coming in. So we'll just do some work on that and see how specific we can get, but whatever we can provide, we will. Okay.
I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Great, that would be great. Thank you so much. The $2 million in equity funding that was canceled in 2015, along with the tax credit, was really important to the industry, as we've discussed before. It helped productions leverage other funding from different levels of government, but also different private funds. It was especially important to small productions that are the key to building the show and showcasing the Nova Scotia talent. And of course, that talent pool is key to attracting larger productions. It's all part of this, beautiful web. Can you explain why it was cut, and are you considering reinstating it?
I
recognize the Honourable Minister of Business.
Yeah, so two things. I'll be as quick as I can here on this one, because it's multifaceted. One aspect of it is we really shifted. I just wanted to find out what the exact numbers were, but we shifted to the Creative Industries Fund, which landed under CCH, and that is a $2 million investment. So the money was, I think, equitable. I think the original one was $2 million, and that's now shifted to CCH. But having said that, if there was one issue outside of all the other things, and I don't want to rank importance for Laura and Mike, but outside of the overall, allotment of money for the incentive fund, overall, even over and above the infrastructure piece, although it's all important, this particular piece around the equity fund is the one that they continue to bring back and bring back and bring back, because they just link it to the importance of absolutely organic production. So, sound stages and investment and bringing people in, that's all great. But when you're talking about the writers who are sort of, independent, and they're looking to put together a screenplay or have something funded that they can get as of a pitch, so to speak, as a sort of a plan that's somewhat commercial, that they could commercialize. Then that matters to them. And I think that having access to that money that there was 123 projects funded under the CCH program, but without question, that's one that Screen Nova Scotia have been advocating for, and we're still talking about what that looks like moving forward for the 5-year review.
Order. Time has lapsed for the NDP caucus.